Hey guys, and welcome back to Star City Studios tutorials. My name's Jay Picasso, and today we're going to be looking at how to make your snare drum crack. So snare drums tend to be one of the main instruments in most commercial songs, along with the kick drum and the hi-hat patterns which make up, of course, the drums. The snare drum tends to be one of the most important sounds in terms of giving your audience a sense of rhythm. That being said, today we're going to look closely at what the snare drum does in order to make it stand out more, to crack more, and to give it a bit more body and weight. So we're going to get straight into it. First things first, we're going to take a look at my snare drum. Just a reminder, this is the same track that we were working on in the previous tutorial, but obviously we're looking at the snare today. So just a quick reminder. So that being said, the only thing that I've done in addition to the track that we were working on last time is I've actually added this clap. Now I've done that because I want to add slightly more dynamic on the 2 and 4 of the claps. Okay, so as you can see here, I've got 1 going by itself. This is the snare drums I'm now referring to. 2 happens with the clap, as 3 goes by itself, 4 with the clap, so on and so forth. So I'm going to include this element to add a bit more dynamic and to make it stand out and pop a little bit more. That being said, let's just jump straight into the snare all by itself and let's get cracking. So as per usual, one of the main things that we're actually going to do here is just work with the EQ. So I'm just going to open up a new EQ channel. I'm going to turn on the analyzer. We're using the Logic standard one just for any users that are without any additional plugins, which I highly recommend the Waves plugin bundle, by the way. If you haven't got that, it's definitely worth investigating. But for the time being, we're just going to work with this EQ here. So I've turned on the analyzer and we're just going to listen to what the snare drum does. I'm going to put on the click track just for some context. Here we go. So what's important to note about the snare drum, and most snare drums for this sake, not all, but most will have a lot of the information happening around this sort of top end. So somewhere between 1K and let's say about 8K. That's where most of the snare drum information tends to sit. Now, this is quite a natural thing because obviously snare drums are really snappy, sort of punchy instruments by nature. And if you've ever seen a drummer play a live drum kit, then it's the one thing that they will whack with full intensity every single time. It's also a really good indication of tempo. Most people, if they can't seem to find the rhythm, can still clap along to any beat, and that tends to be where the snare drum hits. So with that in mind, a lot of the information that we're looking at from this particular snare drum happens, as I said, between 1 and 8K. Now, interestingly enough, we are going to do a little bit of boosting in that area, but the bulk of the boosting we're actually going to do towards the lower end, around the 500 Hertz mark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play back the snare and I'm going to start to boost around 500 Hertz to start. Okay. Now, immediately you should hear how the snare drum has just been given a lot more body. Now, the 500, again, given that most of the information is happening up here, there's a lot that can be boosted in the 500 to make it that much more punchier. One thing I will say about this particular region here is that vocals tend to sit in the 500 mark. I mean, there's a lot of information that happens with vocals up in the high ends as well. However, a lot of the vocal track and body and weight of vocals tend to sit around the 500 Hertz mark as well. So what you want to do is just bear that in mind whenever mixing an instrumental track, because obviously you may have to compensate for that somewhere later in the mix when adding your vocals to it. So let's continue to just tweak this 500 Hertz just to get the most out of it. What I'll do as we listen back is I'll just boost it a lot, probably too much, just so you can hear what's happening a bit more, and then I'll bring it back to where I think is suitable. Now that much, you can hear it. It's almost changing the entire character of the snare drum. If I just A-B that by turning this on and off so you can hear how it sounds with and without the EQ affecting it. That's with it on, off. Can you hear how much body is coming through? Almost too much. It's almost like the whole snare is nothing but body now. And of course, we don't want it to be just that. We do want it to have that punch, but of course, we also want it to have that snap. So I'm going to reduce this back to what I think is a sensible level, and then we'll start to work on the snap as well. So just to A/B that, just so we can hear what that's done. On, off. Still quite a lot of effect when you consider how little we're actually adding here, to be honest with you. But that's about right. I might narrow it just a little bit more so we don't get too much of that low end. But that feels about right. Okay, so onto our next part, onto the snapping part of the snare drum. The characteristic that most people identify when they listen to snare drums is the snapping part. This is also why some producers use things like claps or snaps in order to replace a snare drum, because that is one of its main characteristics. So let's have a look at the snap area. Now what I'm going to do really for the snap is I'm going to start to boost around 3K. Anything more than that and we're going to start to kind of walk into the hi-hat zone of a drum pattern. And I'll just show you what I mean by that by boosting just above 10K. It becomes very, very tinny. It starts to lose its weight a little bit, even though that we've added this. And so it's an area that we don't really want to start to increase on our snare. It's doing so much all by itself that we don't really need to add anything to that area. Now, let's have a look at the 3K area and see what we can do there to get some of that snap out. Again, just to show you what that would sound like if I boosted that too much. You can hear it kind of picking up on a note, if that makes sense. Of course, within the snare instrument, there are tonal elements going on. And the more I boost at this sort of 3K mark, we can hear one of those particular tonal elements start to come out of the drum a bit more. Almost too much, of course. So let's just reduce that back and get that to a nice snapping level. Now, just to A/B what that sounds like. So with it on first, with it off, huge difference in weight, huge difference in delivery, and huge difference in impact. This is how we have to treat our snares in order to make them stand out of our mix. So that being said, I added, as I mentioned earlier, the clap. Now I've added the clap to add a little bit more dynamic. So let's just hear how that sounds just by itself. Yeah, so every other snare drum, the clap is coming in. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to do the same thing or a very similar thing with the clap by opening up an EQ and then having a look at the analyzer as to what the clap information is doing. Now, what's interesting about this is although it's happening every other snare drum, you can see that, again, a lot of the information is happening in the same sort of area. With the snare, we were looking between 1K and about 8K. And again, a lot of the information that's happening with this particular clap is happening in that region. So again, what we want to do just to add a bit more weight and a bit more body is we're going to boost around the 500. The clap comes in very low around the 500. So to boost around there should give it quite a nice sense of body. Now, if I just turn the snare off for a second, just so we can hear how the clap sounds by itself. Turn it off. Turn it back on. So what I'm going to do, similar to before, is I'm going to boost this probably more than I should, just to show you exactly what this is doing and how this is impacting the clap. Again, it's giving it a lot of body, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But I think in the context of your mix, it's just something that you don't want to be over boosting. The problem with over boosting stuff is that you end up having to boost other things to compensate, and then you end up with a mix which is just boosting everything essentially. The trick about a lot of mixing is actually to make cuts, but in these particular instances of the snare and kick, we do want to drive these sounds. We do want to drive the impact that these instruments have. So by boosting them a little bit, we just provide that sense of importance in our mix. So I'm just going to bring this back down. And then again, I'm going to bring back in my snare drum now and then start to add some of that snap back to the 3K mark. And just so we can hear what it's doing a bit more, I'm going to bring the clap up in volume a little bit as well, just so we've got more of an impact every time it comes in. Now, I wasn't going to do this, but just so we understand what can make this sound a little bit nicer, is I'm going to just add a quick reverb to the clap. Now, there's 100 different ways to add reverb. Just go and find a reverb that you like. I particularly like this unit, but I'm just going to bus it. I always bus my reverbs. That's a whole other tutorial another time. You can slap a reverb on the channel here, but if you don't, then bussing it just means that you can send, for example, more than one instrument to the same reverb channel without having to overload your CPU. So it's just a good way and an economic way to add reverb, I suppose. So let's just add a little bit of reverb to the clap now and see how that impacts the track. We don't want to add too much, just enough to give it a bit of a flavor. All right, great. So let's hear that in context with the rest of the drums. So the only thing that I probably do now is just give these both a bit more volume. I want them to stand out a little bit more. I want the track to slap a bit more, you know? All right, guys, another one for today, another short one. Hope that's helpful. See you again in the next one. Peace.